When Stephanie White walked into that press conference room last month, she wasn't just accepting a coaching position. She was signing up to either validate Caitlin Clark as the transcendent superstar everyone believes she is, or watch her career become the cautionary tale of wasted potential that haunts the league forever. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the pressure couldn't be more suffocating. This isn't your typical coaching hire where a franchise brings in someone to slowly develop young talent over 3 to 4 seasons. This is a desperate, all-in gamble by an organization that watched their generational talent spend her entire rookie campaign looking increasingly frustrated with a system that seemed designed to waste her brilliance. The Indiana Fever just handed the keys to their kingdom to a coach who has exactly one mandate: turn Caitlin Clark into a champion immediately, or watch her become the next great talent that slips through their fingers. But what makes this situation absolutely fascinating is that White didn't just stumble into this opportunity by accident. She orchestrated it. While everyone was celebrating Clark's record-breaking rookie season and the Fever's surprising playoff appearance, White was quietly studying game film from hundreds of miles away in Connecticut. She was watching a point guard who could thread passes through impossible windows, create shots from distances that defied logic, and elevate her teammates' games to levels they never thought possible. More importantly, she was watching that same point guard getting trapped in an offensive system that felt like trying to fit a lightning bolt into a mason jar. The previous coaching staff had spent months trying to force Clark into a conservative, possession-based offense that completely neutralized her greatest weapons. They wanted her to slow down, to manage the game, to play within predetermined structures that felt suffocating for someone with her vision and creativity. It was basketball malpractice on the highest level, and White knew it. She had just guided the Connecticut Sun to the semifinals using an offensive philosophy that prioritized pace, spacing, and player freedom. Her guards were encouraged to push tempo, create advantages in transition, and make split-second decisions based on what the defense was giving them. It was the exact opposite of what Clark had been enduring in Indianapolis, and White understood that this represented the opportunity of a lifetime. The moment Christy Sides was dismissed, White made her intentions crystal clear. This wasn't going to be a patient rebuilding project where they gradually developed chemistry and hoped for organic growth over multiple seasons. This was going to be a surgical transformation of an entire franchise culture, and it was going to happen immediately. The front office had already signaled their desperation by making dramatic changes to their executive structure. They brought back Kelly Krauskopf, the architect of their 2012 championship team, specifically because they needed someone with the ruthlessness to make uncomfortable decisions. Krauskopf had built championship teams before, and she understood that you don't waste generational talent by being cautious or sentimental about roster construction. The writing was already on the wall. This organization was preparing for war. White's hiring wasn't just about finding a better coach. It was about finding someone who could unlock the full potential of a roster that already featured 2 cornerstone pieces in Clark and Aaliyah Boston, plus enough salary cap flexibility to completely reshape their supporting cast. The pressure on White is absolutely crushing because everyone understands what's at stake here. Clark's rookie season generated more revenue, more media attention, and more national interest than the WNBA had seen in years. But if the Fever waste that momentum by failing to build a contender around her, they risk losing not just their star players' prime years, but the entire cultural shift she's created for women's basketball. White knows that she's not just coaching basketball games. She's protecting an investment that could define the league's trajectory for the next decade. The clock is already ticking and there's no margin for error. The roster moves that happen over the next few months will determine whether this bold coaching change becomes the catalyst for a dynasty, or the beginning of one of the most disappointing what-if stories in professional sports. The first thing White did after accepting the job wasn't organize team meetings or study game film. She walked into the front office and demanded to see every single contract on the roster, every trade exception they had available, and the exact amount of salary cap space they could work with this offseason. Because White understood something that the previous regime had completely missed. You don't build around generational talent by hoping your current pieces eventually figure it out. You ruthlessly optimize every single roster spot to maximize their strengths. And what she discovered when she examined those contracts changed everything. The Fever weren't just sitting on a talented young core. They were sitting on one of the most flexible financial situations in the entire league, with multiple veteran contracts coming off the books and enough cap space to completely reimagine their supporting cast. This wasn't going to be a gradual evolution. This was going to be a complete metamorphosis. White's offensive system is built around a simple but devastating concept. Create as much space as possible, push the pace relentlessly, and let your best playmaker make decisions in real time rather than forcing them to execute predetermined plays. For someone with Clark's court vision and passing ability, it's the difference between painting with a full palette versus being handed a single crayon. The previous coaching staff had been terrified of Clark's aggressive style, constantly trying to rein her in and force her into safer, more conservative decision-making. They wanted her to manage possessions rather than create them, to limit turnovers rather than maximize assists. White took the completely opposite approach. Her philosophy is that a few extra turnovers are an acceptable price to pay for unleashing a player who can average 12 assists per game when given complete freedom to operate. But unlocking Clark's potential was only the beginning of White's master plan. She had been studying film of the league's most successful teams, and she noticed a pattern that most people were completely missing. The championship contenders weren't just collecting talented players. They were collecting players whose specific skill sets created mathematical nightmares for opposing defenses. The Las Vegas Aces had built their dynasty around having multiple players who could score from all three levels. The New York Liberty had surrounded their stars with shooters who could space the floor and defensive specialists who could switch onto anyone. White realized that the Fever needed to follow that exact blueprint, but with one crucial difference. Everything had to be designed around maximizing Clark's unique ability to create advantages for her teammates. That meant surrounding her with players who could finish in transition, knock down catch-and-shoot threes, and defend well enough to get stops that led to those fast break opportunities. The current roster had some of those pieces, but it also had several players whose skill sets directly conflicted with what White was trying to accomplish. And that's where the situation gets absolutely fascinating, because White's vision for this team requires some incredibly difficult decisions about players who had been productive contributors during Clark's rookie season. The front office is already facing their first major test of commitment to this new direction, and it involves a player whose future with the team has become the subject of intense speculation around the league. White's system demands that every player on the court can either shoot from distance or defend multiple positions, preferably both. Players who can only operate effectively in the paint or who require significant post touches become liabilities in her pace and space approach. This creates an immediate roster construction dilemma that the front office has to solve before they can start adding the pieces they actually need. But White isn't just thinking about subtraction. She's already identified the exact types of players who could turn this Fever team into an unstoppable force, and some of those targets have connections to her previous coaching stops that could give Indiana a significant advantage in recruiting. The league's other general managers are starting to wake up to what's happening in Indianapolis, and several front offices are reportedly making preemptive moves to prevent their best players from ending up in Fever uniforms. Because everyone understands that if White successfully executes her vision, the Fever won't just be competitive. They'll be the template that every other team has to copy just to keep up. The blueprint is already in motion, the salary cap space is available, and the recruiting has quietly begun. What happens over the next 60 days will determine whether this bold experiment transforms the Fever into a dynasty, or becomes another cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to build too much too quickly. The first domino fell during a private meeting between White and the front office that lasted nearly 4 hours and ended with what one source described as the most uncomfortable conversation about roster construction anyone in that building had ever witnessed. White didn't waste time with diplomatic language or gradual suggestions. She walked into that room with a detailed presentation that identified every player on the current roster as either a perfect fit for her system, a potential trade asset, or a complete obstacle to winning a championship. The results were brutal and immediate. Within days of that meeting, league insiders started hearing whispers about players whose agents were quietly being told to explore their options, and veteran contributors who were suddenly finding their phone calls to coaching staff going unreturned. But the most telling sign of how serious this transformation was going to be came when the front office started making calls to other teams about players who had been considered untouchable just months earlier. The Fever weren't just willing to make difficult decisions about their roster. They were actively seeking them out. White's evaluation process was ruthlessly mathematical. She had broken down every possession from Clark's rookie season and identified the exact moments when the offense looked unstoppable versus the moments when it completely stagnated. The pattern was obvious and devastating. When Clark was surrounded by players who could shoot from distance, move without the ball, and finish in transition, the Fever's offensive rating was comparable to championship teams. When she was playing with post-heavy players who clogged driving lanes and demanded touches in the paint, their offensive efficiency dropped to league-worst levels. Armed with that data, White made her position crystal clear. Every single roster spot had to be optimized around Clark's strengths, regardless of how productive those players had been in different roles. The front office knew they were about to make some enemies, but they also understood that this was their only path to relevance in a league dominated by established superpowers. The timeline for this transformation is what makes the entire situation so fascinating and terrifying for the rest of the league. White isn't planning to gradually implement her system over multiple seasons while slowly acquiring the right pieces. She's demanding that the roster be completely reconstructed before training camp begins, which means the Fever have roughly 8 weeks to execute one of the most aggressive roster overhauls in recent memory. That compressed timeline is forcing them to be incredibly creative about how they acquire talent, and it's leading to some surprising conversations around the league. Multiple sources have confirmed that the Fever are willing to package draft picks, young players, and salary cap relief in ways that most teams would consider overly aggressive, simply because they believe their window with Clark is too valuable to waste on patient roster building. They're offering immediate solutions to other teams' salary cap problems in exchange for players who fit White's specific criteria, and several franchises are reportedly intrigued by deals that would have seemed impossible just months ago. But the most intriguing part of their strategy involves targeting players who are currently stuck in situations that don't maximize their skill sets. White has identified several veterans around the league who could immediately upgrade the Fever's rotation if they were placed in the right system. These aren't necessarily household names or all-star players. They're specialists who excel at specific aspects of basketball that happen to align perfectly with what Clark needs from her supporting cast. The recruiting process is already underway, and White is using her connections from previous coaching stops to create opportunities for conversations that wouldn't normally happen between players and rival organizations. She's essentially running a shadow recruitment operation while the official free agency period hasn't even begun, laying groundwork for moves that could completely reshape the league's competitive balance. The most fascinating aspect of this entire process is watching how other teams are reacting to what's happening in Indianapolis. Several front offices have reportedly started making preemptive contract offers to their own players, specifically to prevent them from being lured away by the Fever's aggressive approach. The league office is quietly monitoring the situation because they understand that if White's experiment succeeds, it could fundamentally change how teams approach roster construction around star players. But success isn't guaranteed, and the risks of this strategy are becoming more apparent with each passing day. The pressure on White to deliver immediate results is creating a situation where every single transaction will be scrutinized and every win or loss will be viewed as validation or condemnation of this aggressive approach. The clock is ticking, the targets have been identified, and the first major moves are expected within days. The first target White identified wasn't a superstar free agent or a blockbuster trade candidate. It was a 26-year-old wing player who had been completely misused by her previous team and was quietly available for a fraction of what her skill set was actually worth. This player had spent 3 seasons being forced into a role that highlighted her weaknesses while completely ignoring her elite shooting ability and defensive versatility. White had studied enough film to know that in the right system, this player could immediately solve multiple roster problems while costing significantly less than marquee free agents. The negotiation took exactly 18 hours from initial contact to sign contract, and it sent a clear message to the rest of the league about how the Fever were planning to operate this offseason. They weren't going to get caught up in bidding wars for obvious targets that every other team was pursuing. They were going to identify undervalued talent, move with surgical precision, and acquire exactly what they needed before anyone else realized what was happening. But that signing was just the opening move in a chess game that White had been planning since the moment she accepted the job. The real prize she was targeting required a completely different approach, because this player wasn't available through traditional free agency. She was going to require a trade that involved multiple teams, several draft picks, and some creative salary cap maneuvering that most front offices wouldn't even attempt. White had identified a versatile forward who was currently buried on a rebuilding team's bench, playing out of position and watching her value decrease with each passing game. This player had the exact combination of size, shooting, and defensive awareness that would make Clark's life exponentially easier on both ends of the court. The problem was that her current team had no incentive to trade her unless they received something that significantly improved their own rebuilding timeline. That's where the Fever's front office got creative in ways that surprised even veteran league executives. Instead of offering a traditional package of picks and players, they constructed a 3-team trade scenario that gave each franchise exactly what they needed while allowing Indiana to acquire their target without sacrificing any of their core pieces. The negotiations took 6 weeks and involved conference calls between 3 different time zones. But when the deal was finally announced, It left basketball analysts struggling to understand how the Fever had managed to upgrade their roster while actually improving their salary cap situation. White's fingerprints were all over the trade structure because she had insisted that every move they made had to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. They couldn't just acquire talent. They had to acquire the right talent while maintaining flexibility for future moves. The reaction around the league was immediate and telling. Several general managers who had been planning their own off-season moves suddenly found themselves scrambling to adjust their strategies because the Fever had completely changed the market dynamics. Players who had been considering multiple options started reaching out to their agents about potential opportunities in Indianapolis. Veterans who had been resigned to playing on mediocre teams began wondering if joining the Fever's project might be their path to a championship. But the most significant development came when one of the league's established stars made an unexpected phone call to White's agent. This wasn't a player who anyone expected to be available. She was under contract with a playoff team and had never publicly expressed any dissatisfaction with her current situation. But behind closed doors, she had been watching what was happening in Indianapolis with growing interest, and she had started asking questions about what it would take to become part of White's vision. The conversation that followed that phone call lasted 3 hours and ended with both sides agreeing to explore possibilities that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Word of those discussions leaked within days, and it sent shockwaves through front offices across the league because everyone understood the implications. If the Fever could somehow acquire this caliber of player, they wouldn't just be building a competitive team. They would be creating a super team that could dominate the league for years. But orchestrating that move would require navigating salary cap complexities, convincing multiple parties to cooperate, and executing a timeline that most experts considered impossible. The pressure on White to deliver results was already intense, but now it had reached a completely different level. Every decision she made was being analyzed by league executives who were trying to understand whether her aggressive approach was brilliant strategy or dangerous overreach. The answers would come soon enough, because the most critical phase of her plan was about to begin. The player she was targeting had made it clear that she would only consider a trade if the Fever could guarantee they were serious about winning immediately. No rebuilding projects, no patient development timelines, and no empty promises about future competitiveness. White's response was simple: give us 3 months and we'll show you exactly what we're building. That 3-month challenge turned into the most aggressive recruitment campaign the league had ever witnessed, and it started with White doing something that most coaches would consider career suicide. She began publicly guaranteeing championship contention within 2 seasons. Not eventual competitiveness. Not gradual improvement. Championship contention with a specific timeline that left zero room for excuses or extended development phases. The boldness of that declaration sent ripples throughout the basketball world because everyone understood the implications. White wasn't just expressing confidence in her coaching ability. She was putting her entire reputation on the line while creating expectations that would either validate her as a visionary or destroy her credibility forever. But that public commitment served a strategic purpose that most people completely missed. Elite players don't want to hear about potential or long-term projects. They want to hear about guaranteed opportunities to compete for titles while they're still in their prime. White's willingness to stake her career on immediate success became the most compelling recruiting pitch any coach had made in years. Within weeks of that announcement, player agents around the league started receiving unusual phone calls from their clients asking specific questions about Indiana's roster construction and salary cap situation. Veterans who had never considered the Fever as a legitimate destination were suddenly interested in understanding White's offensive philosophy and how their skill sets might fit into her system. The momentum was building exactly as White had planned, but it was also creating problems she hadn't anticipated. The league's established powerhouses were starting to take notice of what was happening in Indianapolis, and several front offices began making preemptive moves to prevent their own players from being lured away by White's aggressive approach. Contract extensions that had been stalled for months were suddenly fast-tracked. Players who had been requesting trades were offered improved roles and increased playing time. Veteran stars who had been considering testing free agency were presented with restructured deals that made leaving financially impossible. The Fever's recruitment campaign was forcing the entire league to react defensively, which created both opportunities and obstacles for White's master plan. On one hand, the competitive pressure was validating her belief that other teams viewed Indiana as a legitimate threat. On the other hand, it was making some of her primary targets significantly more expensive and difficult to acquire. But White had anticipated this exact scenario, which is why she had been working on multiple contingency plans simultaneously. While everyone was focused on the high-profile players she was publicly pursuing, She had been quietly laying groundwork for alternative moves that could accomplish the same roster construction goals through different methods. The strategy involved identifying players whose contracts contained specific clauses or options that could be leveraged in unexpected ways. Veterans who had player options for the following season. International players whose WNBA rights were held by teams that had no intention of bringing them over. Former stars who were considering comebacks but hadn't committed to specific franchises. White's background as both a player and coach had given her connections throughout basketball that extended far beyond the current WNBA roster, and she was using every single one of those relationships to create opportunities that wouldn't show up on any traditional free agent list. The most intriguing conversation involved a player who had been playing overseas for 2 seasons but was reportedly interested in returning to the WNBA under the right circumstances. This player had been an all-star before leaving for Europe, and her specific skill set would address multiple needs in White's system. More importantly, her WNBA rights were currently held by a team that was undergoing a complete rebuild and had no immediate use for a veteran player with championship expectations. The negotiation to acquire those rights required offering future draft compensation that most teams would consider excessive, but White convinced the front office that the investment was worthwhile because this player could immediately upgrade their roster while costing significantly less than comparable free agents. When the trade was announced, it caught everyone off guard because most people hadn't realized this player was even considering a return to the league. But the real shock came when she held her introductory press conference and revealed that White's recruitment pitch had lasted less than 20 minutes because the vision was so compelling and the timeline so ambitious that she couldn't resist being part of it. That signing sent a clear message to every other player White was targeting. The Fever weren't just making promises about future competitiveness. They were actively assembling a roster that could challenge for championships immediately. The dominoes were starting to fall exactly as White had planned, but the most critical phase of her recruitment campaign was still ahead. The player she wanted most was finally ready to have a serious conversation about joining the project, but orchestrating that move would require executing the most complex transaction of White's career. The player she wanted most wasn't some veteran role player looking for a fresh start. It was a young star whose talent had been trapped in basketball purgatory, wasting away on a franchise that had no clue how to unlock her full destructive potential. And when White finally sat down across from her in a private meeting that stretched until 2 a.m., the conversation didn't revolve around money or playing time. It centered on legacy. What White laid out that night wasn't a sales pitch. It was a complete architectural blueprint for domination, with Caitlin Clark positioned at the center like a conductor with an unlimited orchestra at her disposal. The star listened silently as White broke down exactly how her combination of size, perimeter shooting and switchable defense would transform Clark from a highlight machine into an absolute nightmare for every defense in the league. The numbers didn't lie. Pairing this forward with Clark's unmatched court vision would create spacing that stretched defenses from baseline to baseline. Transition opportunities would multiply. Driving lanes would open like floodgates. And the defensive versatility would finally give Clark the stops she desperately needed to fuel her preferred breakneck pace. But pulling off the deal required more than just convincing one player. It demanded a 3-team orchestration involving salary dumps, future first-round protections that other GMs called highway robbery, and a level of front-office coordination that felt more like corporate espionage than basketball transactions. When the paperwork finally cleared, the basketball world stopped scrolling. This wasn't an incremental upgrade. This was the kind of move that instantly elevated the Fever from intriguing storyline to legitimate title favorite. League insiders who had dismissed Indiana's offseason as typical small-market noise suddenly found themselves rewriting their power rankings with the Fever sitting at the very top. The shocking part wasn't just who they added. It was how perfectly everything aligned with White's vision. The new arrival could sprint the wings on Clark's signature full-court pushes, knock down trailing threes from NBA range, and guard the opponent's best perimeter threat when the game tightened up in the fourth quarter. Clark would no longer have to create offense in a vacuum. She would have co-stars who turned her passes into instant buckets. And this acquisition was only one piece of the larger surgical strike. While the basketball public was still processing that blockbuster, White and the front office were already finalizing the re-signing of their explosive shooting guard who had become Clark's perfect complement during that chaotic rookie year. The negotiations weren't about offering the highest dollar. They were about painting a picture of sustained excellence, of back-to-back deep playoff runs, of becoming the face of a dynasty rather than chasing one-off paydays on lesser teams. The guard didn't need much convincing once White showed her the film breakdowns. The read-and-react offense would keep defenses guessing. The 5-out spacing would give her clean looks she'd never seen before. Most importantly, playing alongside Clark had already exploded her personal brand in ways no marketing team could replicate. Staying meant championships, spotlight, and a legacy that extended far beyond the court. With those two moves locked in, the roster started taking shape like a custom-built supercar. Aaliyah Boston anchoring the paint as a two-way force. The new forward stretching the floor. The shooting guard punishing defenses from the perimeter. And Clark operating with total freedom, no longer forced to carry an ill-fitting system on her shoulders. The league's power brokers weren't just watching anymore. They were panicking. Phone calls between GMs spiked as teams realized the Fever had gone from afterthought to arms race participant in a single offseason. Some franchises doubled down on their own stars. Others began quietly shopping veterans who no longer fit their timelines. The entire competitive balance of the WNBA was shifting because one coach refused to accept gradual progress. Yet even with this firepower, White understood the job wasn't finished. One more elite piece remained on her wish list. A defensive specialist whose physicality and basketball IQ could provide the missing grit this super team needed when opponents turned games into street fights. The question hanging over the entire league now is whether the Fever can actually close on that final target before someone else swoops in. Because if they do, what they're building won't just compete with the established dynasties. It might render them obsolete. The shocking move that started all this speculation has now become something much larger. A declaration that the Indiana Fever aren't just trying to keep up anymore. They're coming for the throne. And Caitlin Clark is no longer waiting for help to arrive. It's already here. The defensive specialist White was targeting wasn't some unknown commodity buried on a struggling franchise's depth chart. She was a former Defensive Player of the Year whose career had been derailed by injuries and coaching changes, but whose film study revealed something that most teams had completely overlooked. Her defensive instincts hadn't disappeared. They had been suppressed by systems that asked her to do everything instead of focusing on what made her elite in the first place. White's approach to recruiting her was completely different from every other conversation she'd had that offseason. Instead of selling vision or championship potential, she showed up with 3 hours of game film and a simple question. Do you want to be the reason Caitlin Clark becomes unstoppable? The film sessions revealed how this defender's unique combination of lateral quickness and basketball IQ could neutralize the exact types of players who had given Clark the most trouble during her rookie season. Physical guards who tried to bump her off her spots. Versatile forwards who could switch onto her in pick-and-roll situations. Veterans who used their experience to disrupt her rhythm with perfectly timed double teams. With this defender on the court, those tactics would become completely obsolete. But the recruitment conversation went deeper than basketball strategy. White understood that elite defenders are motivated by pride more than money, and this player's pride had been wounded by 2 seasons of diminished roles and questioning media coverage. The opportunity to become the defensive anchor for a championship contender wasn't just about basketball fit. It was about redemption, about proving that reports of her decline had been greatly exaggerated. The signing announcement came at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, delivered through a simple social media post that sent shockwaves through group chats and front office conference rooms across the league. Because now the picture was complete. The Fever had assembled a starting lineup that could run opponents off the court in transition, space the floor to perfection in half-court sets, and lock down defensively when games became grinding affairs. Every single player complemented Clark's strengths while covering her few weaknesses. But the most terrifying aspect of what White had constructed wasn't visible in box scores or depth charts. It was the psychological warfare she had unleashed on the rest of the league. Opposing coaches now had to prepare for a team that could legitimately beat you in 5 different ways. If you tried to slow down Clark with physical defense, her teammates would punish you from the perimeter. If you focused on stopping their shooters, Clark would dissect you with drives and lobs to the rim. If you tried to outrun them in transition, their defensive intensity would force turnovers that fed directly into their preferred pace. The strategic nightmares were keeping coaching staffs awake at night, but the personnel problems were even worse. Most teams in the league had constructed their rosters around specific identities and playing styles that had proven successful over multiple seasons. The Fever's transformation forced everyone to question whether those approaches could still compete against this level of talent and tactical sophistication. Veterans who had been comfortable in their established roles were suddenly being asked to expand their skill sets. Young players who had been developing at reasonable paces were being pushed to accelerate their timelines. Entire offensive and defensive schemes were being scrapped because they couldn't handle what Indianapolis was planning to unleash. The Fever hadn't just improved their own roster. They had forced the entire league into an uncomfortable evolution that most franchises weren't prepared to handle. White's master plan was working exactly as she had envisioned, but it was also creating pressure that extended far beyond wins and losses. The media attention surrounding Clark's rookie season had already elevated the league's profile to unprecedented levels. Now that attention would be focused on whether this super team could deliver on the championship expectations that White had so boldly proclaimed. Every game would be analyzed. Every lineup decision would be scrutinized. Every loss would be treated as evidence that the experiment was failing. The margin for error had essentially disappeared, which meant that White's coaching would have to be as flawless as the roster construction had been. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this entire transformation was watching how it affected Clark herself. The rookie who had spent her first season carrying an enormous burden while learning to navigate professional basketball would now enter her second year with elite talent surrounding her and championship expectations that matched her own ambitions. The question that no one could answer was whether she would thrive under that pressure or be overwhelmed by it. Training camp was still weeks away, but the psychological dynamics were already shifting in ways that would determine whether this bold experiment became the blueprint for future super teams or a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to accelerate championship timelines. The league was about to find out if Stephanie White's vision was genius or madness. And Caitlin Clark was about to discover if she was truly the transformative superstar everyone believed her to be. The first leak came from a practice facility janitor who overheard assistant coaches discussing defensive rotations at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Within hours, social media was buzzing with reports that the Fever's coaching staff had been working around the clock, redesigning their entire playbook to accommodate the nuclear arsenal they had just assembled. White wasn't just implementing a new system. She was creating basketball that had never been played before at the professional level. The leaked practice footage that surfaced 3 days later sent the basketball world into complete chaos. 47 seconds of cell phone video showing Clark threading passes through spaces that shouldn't exist, while her new teammates moved with a synchronicity that typically takes years to develop. The most shocking part wasn't the individual brilliance on display. It was how effortless everything looked despite the complexity of what they were executing. League executives who had been skeptical about whether this collection of talent could actually function as a cohesive unit suddenly found themselves scrambling to understand how the Fever had solved chemistry problems that had destroyed other superteam experiments. The answer was hidden in White's preparation process, which had begun months before any of these players had officially joined the roster. While other coaches spent their off-seasons running generic camps and hoping new additions would figure out their roles organically, White had been creating detailed statistical models that predicted exactly how each player's skill set would interact with the others. She knew which offensive sets would maximize their spacing. She knew which defensive rotations would cover their individual weaknesses. Most importantly, she knew how to structure practices so that building chemistry became inevitable rather than hoped for. The psychological aspect of her approach was equally calculated. Instead of asking veteran players to sacrifice touches or reduce their roles, White had designed a system where everyone's individual statistics would actually improve while winning became significantly more likely. It was the kind of win-win scenario that most coaches talk about but few actually achieve. But the real test wasn't happening in controlled practice environments. It was playing out in the media circus that had descended upon Indianapolis like a Category 5 hurricane. National television crews were setting up permanent bases outside the team facility. ESPN had assigned 3 full-time reporters to cover nothing but Fever news. The Las Vegas odds for the championship had shifted so dramatically that several sportsbooks temporarily stopped taking bets. Clark, who had spent her rookie season learning to handle unprecedented attention for a WNBA player, was now dealing with pressure that felt more like what LeBron James experienced when he joined the Miami Heat. Every interview became a minefield of questions about championship expectations. Every social media post was analyzed for signs of team chemistry or locker room tension. Every practice was monitored by media members looking for evidence that the super team was either coming together perfectly or falling apart behind closed doors. The psychological pressure was intensified by the reactions from the league's established powers, who weren't content to simply watch their championship windows close without fighting back. Las Vegas made a shocking trade of their own, acquiring a defensive specialist whose entire job description was neutralizing point guards like Clark. New York restructured their entire offense around exploiting what they perceived as weaknesses in the Fever's defensive scheme. Connecticut began implementing a physical, grinded-out style specifically designed to disrupt Indianapolis's preferred pace. The arms race that White had triggered was forcing every contender to evolve, which meant the Fever's path to a championship had actually become more difficult despite their roster improvements. But perhaps the most fascinating development was watching how Clark herself was handling the transformation from promising rookie to the centerpiece of the league's most scrutinized franchise. Her public comments remained focused and confident, but teammates noticed subtle changes in her preparation routine and practice intensity that suggested she understood exactly how much was now riding on her shoulders. The supporting cast she had desperately needed was finally in place, but that meant excuses were no longer available. If this experiment failed, it wouldn't be because of inadequate talent or poor roster construction. It would be because the player everyone believed was destined for greatness couldn't deliver when it mattered most. Training camp was scheduled to begin in 8 days, which would provide the first real glimpse of whether White's bold vision could translate from theory into championship-caliber basketball. The entire league would be watching because everyone understood that the success or failure of this experiment would influence how teams approach roster construction for the next decade. Stephanie White had promised to validate Caitlin Clark as a transcendent superstar or watch her career become a cautionary tale. In 8 days, that promise would finally be tested.